This video covers a real criminal case. All information presented is sourced from public court records, official police reports, and verified news sources. In May of 2005, an 18-year-old honor student from Mountain Brook, Alabama walked out of a nightclub in Aruba and was never seen again. It took 18 years, a second killing in another country, and a secret recording by a Dutch journalist before anyone heard the truth about what happened to Natalee Holloway. Natalee was days away from starting college at the University of Alabama on a full scholarship.
She had graduated with honors from Mountain Brook High School and joined roughly 100 classmates on a senior trip to the island of Aruba in the Caribbean.
On the night of May 29, 2005, the group went to a popular bar and restaurant called Carlos and Charlie's in the Palm Beach tourist district of Oranjestad. Sometime around 1:30 in the morning on May 30th, witnesses saw Natalee leave the bar with three young men. One of them was Joran van der Sloot, a 17-year-old Dutch national living in Aruba. The other two were brothers Deepak and Satish Kalpoe, local residents. By the next morning, when the group was scheduled to fly home, Natalee was not at the hotel. She never boarded her flight. Her passport and packed luggage were still in her room. You're watching Dark Verdict, where we investigate the cases that haunt us. Natalee's mother, Beth Holloway, flew to Aruba within hours of learning her daughter had not returned. Aruban police began their investigation but did not arrest Joran van der Sloot or the Kalpoe brothers for 10 days. When they finally brought the three in for questioning on June 9, 2005, the stories did not line up. Van der Sloot initially told investigators he and the Kalpoe brothers had dropped Natalee off at her Holiday Inn hotel and that he watched her walk toward a security guard near the entrance. The Kalpoe brothers gave a similar version of events at first. But as detectives pressed harder, the accounts shifted. Van der Sloot changed his story multiple times. In one version, he said he left Natalee on the beach near the Marriott Hotel, alone, and that she was fine when he walked away. In another version, he claimed she had been drinking heavily and he could not wake her. Each new interview produced a different timeline, a different location, a different explanation. Deepak Kalpoe later told investigators that Van der Sloot had been alone with Natalee after they dropped the two of them off near the beach. All three were eventually released. No charges were filed in Aruba. The island's small police force was not equipped for a case drawing international attention. The FBI sent agents to assist. Search teams combed beaches, drained swamps, and used sonar to scan the ocean floor off the northwest coast of Aruba. Volunteer divers searched underwater caves. Cadaver dogs were brought in from the Netherlands. Texas volunteer searchers led by Tim Miller of Search joined the effort and spent weeks covering terrain across the island. Not one trace of Natalee was recovered. No clothing, no DNA, no remains. The absence of physical evidence made prosecution nearly impossible under Aruban law. A judge rearrested Van der Sloot briefly in 2007, but he was released again within months due to insufficient evidence to proceed to trial. Then, in 2008, Dutch crime journalist Peter R. de Vries obtained footage that changed the public understanding of this case. De Vries, known for his investigative television program Peter R. de Vries, crime reporter, had arranged for a hidden camera to be placed in a car where Van der Sloot was speaking privately with a friend named Patrick van der Em, who was cooperating with de Vries. On that recording, Van der Sloot said that Natalee had been on the beach with him and that something happened to her. He described calling a friend with a boat and said her body had been taken out to sea. He showed no visible distress while recounting this. He appeared casual. De Vries aired the footage on Dutch television and later won an International Emmy Award in 2008 for his reporting on the Holloway case. Aruban prosecutors reviewed the tape but determined that the statements alone, without corroborating physical evidence, were not sufficient to bring formal charges. Van der Sloot left Aruba. And on May 30, 2010, exactly 5 years to the day after Natalee Holloway vanished, a 21-year-old woman named Stephanie Flores was found deceased in a hotel room in Lima, Peru. The room was registered to Joran van der Sloot. He had fled to Chile but was apprehended by Chilean police and returned to Peru. In January 2012, a Peruvian court convicted van der Sloot of the killing of Stephanie Flores. He was sentenced to 28 years in a Peruvian prison. The date was not a coincidence that investigators overlooked. It sat in the record like a signature. While van der Sloot sat in a prison cell in Lima, he reached out through an attorney to Beth Holloway in 2010 with an offer. He claimed he would reveal the location of Natalee's remains in exchange for $250,000. Beth Holloway, working with the FBI, agreed to an initial payment of $25,000 as part of a sting operation. Van der Sloot took the money. The information he provided about the location was false. He led them to a house in Aruba that had nothing to do with the case. He then used the money to travel to Peru, where he later took the life of Stephanie Flores. Federal prosecutors in the United States charged van der Sloot with wire fraud and extortion for the scheme against Beth Holloway. In 2023, Peru temporarily extradited van der Sloot to the United States to face those federal charges in a Birmingham, Alabama courtroom. On October 18, 2023, van der Sloot stood before a judge and pleaded guilty to the extortion and wire fraud charges. But what happened in that courtroom went beyond the federal case. As part of the proceedings, van der Sloot admitted to killing Natalee Holloway. According to Beth Holloway, who spoke publicly after the hearing, van der Sloot told her he had killed Natalee on the beach. After 18 years of denial, shifting stories, and legal dead ends, he said the words out loud in a federal courtroom. Beth Holloway addressed van der Sloot directly during the proceedings. She looked at the man who had been the last known person with her daughter and said, quote, "You terminated her dreams." She described the years of searching, the false leads, the extortion, and the toll it had taken on her family. Natalee's father, Dave Holloway, had spent nearly 2 decades traveling to Aruba, working with investigators, and publicly advocating for the case to remain open. The family had Natalee declared legally dead in 2012 so they could begin to settle her estate, a legal step that no parent should have to take for a missing child. Van der Sloot was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for the extortion charges. After serving that sentence, he is to be returned to Peru to complete the remainder of his 28-year sentence for the Stephanie Flores case. He will spend decades behind bars. Yet Natalee's remains have never been found.
There is no grave for her family to visit. The beaches of Aruba kept their secret, and the ocean, if that is where she was taken, offered nothing back. De Vries, the journalist whose hidden camera footage came closer than anyone to exposing the truth before the confession, was fatally shot on a street in Amsterdam in July 2021, in a case unrelated to Holloway. He did not live to see van der Sloot finally admit what happened. De Vries had spent years arguing publicly that the evidence pointed in one direction and that the Aruban legal system had failed to act on what was available. Deepak and Satish Kalpoe were arrested and released multiple times over the course of the investigation. In November 2007, an Aruban appeals court ordered their rearrest alongside van der Sloot, but the case against the brothers collapsed once more. Neither Deepak nor Satish was ever formally convicted of any crime related to Natalee's disappearance. They maintained throughout that they had dropped van der Sloot and Natalee near the beach and driven away. No physical evidence or testimony emerged that placed either brother at the scene after that point, and their case was ultimately closed without charges reaching trial. Stephanie Flores Ramirez, the young woman killed in Lima, was a 21-year-old Peruvian business student and the daughter of Ricardo Flores, a well-known circus promoter in Peru. She had met van der Sloot at a poker tournament at the Atlantic City Casino in the Miraflores district of Lima. Hotel security cameras captured the two of them entering van der Sloot's room at the Hotel TAC on the night of May 30, 2010. When staff entered the room 3 days later, they found Stephanie's body. Ricardo Flores spent years after his daughter's death pushing Peruvian authorities to ensure van der Sloot served his full sentence and was not granted early release.
He said publicly that his family had been destroyed by the same man the Holloways had warned the world about 5 years earlier. Phil McGraw, widely known as Dr. Phil, became one of the most prominent media figures to cover the Holloway case over the years. He conducted on-camera interviews with Beth Holloway and later spoke with van der Sloot himself. The case generated thousands of hours of cable news coverage between 2005 and 2010,
with networks sending full production crews to Aruba for months at a time.
Beth Holloway used that sustained attention to advocate for missing persons awareness and helped establish the Natalee Holloway Resource Center at the National Museum of Crime and Punishment in Washington, D.C., which provided information and support for families of missing individuals. Natalee Holloway was 18 years old when she walked off a beach in Aruba and into a silence that lasted nearly 2 decades. Her mother heard a confession in a courtroom in Birmingham. Her father spent years digging through sand on an island 4,000 miles from home.
A journalist in Amsterdam risked his reputation on a hidden camera.
A family in Lima buried a daughter they never expected to lose. All of those threads trace back to one night, one beach, and one man who finally ran out of lies. Subscribe to Dark Verdict. Next case, the witness who saw everything and disappeared.